She had her reasons for looking the way she did, and she had rehearsed them in the mirror of the coaching inn until she was certain she had them right. The woman looking back at her was nobody. That was the point. Dark dress, plain collar, hair pulled back without artistry, the kind of woman a butler glances at and immediately forgets. Nora Caldwell had spent 23 years being precisely the opposite. She had spent the last 3 weeks learning to disappear. The carriage that brought her to Ashbourne had dropped her at the end of the long gravel drive, which was how she had asked it. She needed to walk the approach. She needed to see the house before the house saw her. It rose from the morning mist the way it always had, gray stone and tall windows, the east wing still catching the first light, the copper beech her grandfather had planted near the gate, spreading its burgundy canopy over the north lawn. She had climbed that tree at 7 years old and torn her dress and been scolded by the housekeeper and had not cared even slightly. That housekeeper old staff were gone. Most of the old staff were gone. That was, in a way, what had made this possible. She stood at the gate and looked at the house that had been her home for every year of her life until 3 years ago, and she made herself breathe slowly. Then she picked up her bag, straightened her back, and walked up the drive to ask for the position of lady's companion to the Dowager Countess of Ashbourne. The man who had answered her letter had not been the Duke. It had been his solicitor, a tidy, careful man named Mr. Bassett, who had interviewed her in a rented office in Halifax and had seemed, above all, to want reassurance that she would cause no trouble. She had given him reassurance. She was practiced at giving people what they wanted. What she had not told Mr. Bassett was that her name before her mother's remarriage had been Nora Ashbourne, that the house she was being hired to serve in had been built by her great-great-grandfather, that the estate had passed to her father, and then, through a series of legal instruments she still did not entirely understand, to a distant relation who had promptly sold it. Sold it to settle gambling debts, without so much as informing her that it was being done. She had been 20 years old. She had been in Bath with her aunt. She had come home to find a letter from a solicitor explaining that the estate had been transferred, that the entail had permitted it, that she had no legal recourse, and that the new owner would be taking possession within the month. The new owner was the Duke of Keswick. She had never met him. She knew almost nothing about him except that he was 31, recently returned from several years abroad, and had purchased Ashbourne as his principal English seat. She intended to learn considerably more. The housekeeper who received her at the servants' entrance was a stout, cautious woman called Mrs. Thorne, who looked Nora over in the way of someone assessing a piece of furniture for hidden damage. "You've references from Halifax, Mrs." Thorne said. It was not quite a question. "From Mrs. Alderton Price in Halifax," Nora said. The name was genuine. The woman had been her mother's school friend and had written the letter with full knowledge of what it was for, and had asked only that Nora be careful and write to her when it was over. Mrs. Thorne received this information without enthusiasm. "The Dowager Countess is particular. She's been through 3 companions in 18 months. I've been told." "Has she?" Mrs. Thorne looked at her again. "You'll start this morning. The Countess takes her breakfast at 9 in the east sitting room. You'll read to her in the afternoon. You'll accompany her in the garden if the weather permits, and she's inclined to go, which she generally isn't. You won't offer opinions unless she asks. You won't discuss the family's affairs. You'll—" "I understand," Nora said, quietly but clearly, in a tone that was not quite deferential, and not quite anything else. Mrs. Thorne paused. "You'll address His Grace as your Grace should you encounter him, and you'll take care not to be on foot in the main rooms before noon. He works in the library in the mornings." Nora nodded. She thought. "He works in the library," she thought. "That is my grandfather's library. with the paneled ceiling and the globe in the corner and the smell of wood, smoke, and old paper that I have never found anywhere else in the world. She kept her expression exactly as it was. She encountered the Duke on her second morning. She had been crossing the entrance hall with a book for the Countess, one of the marble-floored rooms she had been specifically told to pass through quickly, and he had come in from outside still in his riding clothes, with mud on his boots and a crop in his hand, and the look of a man who has been up since before dawn and is satisfied about it. He was taller than she had expected. She did not know what she had expected. He had dark hair and a direct way of looking at things, and he stopped when he saw her in the way that people do when they are not accustomed to encountering strangers in their own front halls. "You're the new companion," he said, not rudely, simply, "Yes, Your Grace." He studied her for a moment with an expression that was more assessing than unkind. Then he looked down at his boots. They were genuinely muddy. The exercise yard had been wet that morning. She'd seen it from the Countess's window. "Take these to the boot room," he said. "Mrs. Thorne will tell you where it is." And he walked past her toward the staircase, pulling off his gloves. She stood holding the book in one hand and the boots, which he had simply set down at her feet and apparently assumed she would pick up, in the other. She stood there for one moment longer than was probably advisable. Then she picked up the boots. She told herself, walking toward the back of the house, that it did not matter. She told herself that she had not come here to feel things. She told herself that a man who has just come in from riding and hands his muddy boots to the nearest person available is not necessarily arrogant, that it was the most ordinary thing in the world for a duke to do, that she should not let it settle in her chest like a stone. The stone settled anyway. The Dowager Countess of Ashbourne was 74 years old, sharp as cut glass, and entirely indifferent to the opinions of anyone she had not personally approved. Her name was Lady Constance, and she had lived at Ashbourne since her son, the previous Duke, father of the current one, had installed her in the East Wing some 30 years prior, and she had outlasted him by 12 years and showed no signs of slowing. She had known Nora's family. This was the thing Nora had not fully considered when she had made this plan in the rented room in Halifax. The Countess had known her grandmother. She had attended Nora's parents' wedding. She had sent a letter of condolence when Nora's father died that Nora had read and folded and kept in the small box of things she had managed to save. On her third day, the Countess looked up from her needlework and said, without remind me of someone. Nora kept her eyes on the page she was reading from. "Do I, my lady?" The Ashbourne family. Knew them well. The daughter had your coloring. The Countess squinted. "What was your mother's name?" "Margaret, my lady," which was true. Her mother's name before remarriage had been Margaret Caldwell. After it had been Margaret Ashbourne. Nora had been careful with the order of things. The Countess made a sound that indicated moderate satisfaction and returned to her needlework. But she looked at Nora again before the hour was out, and again at the end of the afternoon, with an expression Nora could not entirely read. The woman who arrived on the 14th day was called Miss Lavinia Croft. She arrived in a traveling carriage with 2 maids and 3 trunks, which was, Nora thought, an extraordinary quantity of luggage for what was supposed to be a fortnight's visit. She was 24, very pretty in a particular deliberate way, and she had the manner of someone who had been told since childhood that they were exceptional and had seen no evidence to contradict this. She was, the household understood within hours of her arrival, being considered as a possible future duchess. This was not a surprise to Nora. She had been in the house 3 weeks, and she had listened carefully, and she had understood that the Duke's aunt in London had been advocating for a match with some urgency, and that the Duke had been resistant in the way of someone who knows they cannot be resistant indefinitely. What was a surprise was how quickly Miss Croft identified Nora as someone to be afraid of. She could not have said why she was afraid. Nora was nobody, a hired companion, a woman with a plain dress and a borrowed reference. But Miss Croft had the instincts of someone who had spent their life watching rooms for threats, and she watched Nora with a bright, careful attention that had nothing friendly in it. On the third evening after dinner, she drew Nora aside in the corridor near the Countess's rooms. "You're very attentive to His Grace," she said pleasantly. "I serve the Countess," Nora said. "I'm often in the same rooms as His Grace." "Of course." Miss Croft smiled. Her smile was like a window with nothing behind it. "I only mention it because I've noticed you tend to position yourself rather centrally in conversations for a companion." Nora looked at her steadily. "I'll bear that in mind, Miss Croft." She walked away, and she was careful not to let her hands clench. In private, in the small room on the upper floor that she had been given, a room with a slanted ceiling that she had never set foot in before in her life, in her own house, she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and thought about what she was doing. She had come here, she reminded herself, to gather information. She had come to understand the legal instruments that had transferred the estate. She had come because the solicitor in London, who was handling her claim needed documents that were almost certainly in the library or the estate office, documents she could not request without alerting the Duke, documents she could not access without being inside the house. She had come for a purpose. She had not come to feel anything in particular about the man who had given her his muddy boots to clean. She found the first document on a Thursday afternoon in October. The Countess had been unwell, nothing serious, a cold that made her irritable and disinclined to be read to, and Nora had been given the afternoon with nothing specific to do. She had walked through the ground floor with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged there, which she was, and which she did, and she had arrived at the estate office. The room was unlocked. She had half expected it to be. The Duke was meticulous about many things, she had learned, but he trusted his own household. She found the deed of transfer in the second drawer, filed between a survey of the north pasture and a letter from an architect about repairs to the west wing roof. She stood at the writing table and read it very carefully. It was exactly what she had suspected, and it was not, on close reading, entirely as final as she had been told. There was a clause, a condition tied to the original entail, that her solicitor in London had been trying to confirm for 4 months. She was standing at the table with the document in her hands when the door opened. The Duke stood in the doorway. He looked at her. He looked at the document. He did not say anything for a moment that lasted considerably longer than it should have. "Miss Caldwell," he said, "Your Grace." She did not put the document down. She had already decided in the 2 seconds she'd had to make the decision that she was finished being careful. "That is a private document." "I know." She set it down on the table, but she kept her hand near it. "I also know what it says. And I know there's a condition in Clause 17 that your solicitor may not have drawn your attention to because it would have complicated the purchase considerably." He came into the room. He was not, she noticed, angry in the way that men are when they want to be frightening. He was something else. Careful, attentive, in the way she had noticed he was when something required his full understanding. "You came here knowing what you'd find," he said. "I came here because I needed to find it." She looked at him directly. "My name before my mother's remarriage was Nora Ashbourne. My father was Edward Ashbourne. This estate was mine before it was yours." The silence was very long. "Yours by what right?" he asked, finally. Not dismissively, as though he genuinely wanted to understand. "By the right of every generation of my family for 140 years, she said. "And by the terms of Clause 17, which requires that in the event of a sale under the existing entail, any surviving direct female issue has 12 months to contest the transfer." "I was not notified of the sale." The 12 months were allowed to pass without my knowledge. She paused. I have a solicitor in London who believes I have a claim. I came here because I needed this document to prove it. He looked at her for a long time. She could not read his expression with any confidence, which was unusual. She had become, over these weeks, reasonably good at reading him. How long have you been Nora Ashbourne in this house? He said. 4 weeks. And before that? The coaching inn. The references from Halifax. He was assembling it. You've been planning this for some time, since the letter from your solicitor arrived telling me the estate had been sold. He moved to the chair behind the writing table and sat down, and she realized, with some surprise, that he was not preparing to have her removed. He was thinking. Show me Clause 17, he said. What followed was 2 hours that she had not planned for. He read the document. He read it again. He asked her 3 questions about the timing of her father's death and the remarriage, which she answered precisely. And then he was quiet for a long time. She remained standing. She had not been invited to sit, and she had too much pride to take a chair in her own estate office without being asked, and she was aware that she was being, possibly, unreasonable about this. He looked up from the document. You cleaned my boots, he said. Yes. You read to my aunt every afternoon for a month, and you were. He stopped. Something moved across his face that was not amusement exactly, but was not amusement. You were the owner of this estate. The rightful owner, she said carefully. Not the legal one, not yet. He stood. He was across the table from her, and the afternoon light was coming through the tall windows. The same windows she had looked through as a child, watching the copper beach in the rain, and he looked at her with an expression she recognized from their weeks in the same rooms, one she had noted and set aside and refused to think carefully about. I bought this estate in good faith, he said. I know, and the transfer as it stands was legal. I know that too. But Clause 17, he stopped. He looked down at the document again. My solicitor should have told me. He may not have known to look for it, or he may have decided it was not his concern. It is very much his concern, the Duke said, and his voice had an edge in it now that she had not heard before, not toward her. And mine. He looked at her again. Miss Ashbourne. She had not been called that in 3 years. It was ridiculous, the way it moved through her. I am not your enemy, he said. I would like you to understand that. I don't know you well enough to know what you are, she said honestly. Something in his face shifted. It was, she thought, the most honest thing she had said to him in 4 weeks, and he seemed to know it. Then stay, he said, not as a companion, as. He paused, and she could see him working through it. The practical mind she had observed all these weeks now applied to one that was not, for once, a problem with a clean solution. Stay as Miss Ashbourne, and we'll send for both our solicitors, and we'll establish what Clause 17 actually means for both of us. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the copper beach moved in the wind off the northern hills. And Miss Croft, she said. Miss Croft, he said evenly, is a guest of my aunt's, not a guest of mine. She will be returning to London at the end of the week. Nora looked at him. He looked back. You'll want time, he said, to consider. I've been considering for 3 years, she said. I don't need more time. The Countess knew before anyone told her. Nora suspected she had known for some time. The morning after the conversation in the estate office, Nora came to the east sitting room in her usual way and sat in her usual chair and opened the book. And the Countess looked at her from across the room with the expression she had been using for the past several weeks. The one Nora had not quite been able to interpret. You're Edward Ashbourne's daughter, the Countess said. Yes, my lady. I knew it when you walked in. I knew it in the first hour. You have his way of standing when you're uncertain, very still, with your hands at your sides. She picked up her needlework. I assumed you had your reasons. I did. And have you sorted them out? Nora thought about the deed of transfer and the solicitor in London, and the Duke sitting behind the writing table in the estate office looking at Clause 17. She thought about the copper beech outside the window. "I think so," she said. "Good." The Countess drew her thread through. "You can stop reading me that dreadful novel now. I never liked it." It was resolved, in the end, the way these things are resolved when both parties have solicitors who are more interested in getting it right than in winning, slowly, carefully, and with more paperwork than seemed possible for a clause that was only 2 sentences long. The estate was held jointly while the legal determination was made. The Duke remained at Ashbourne. So did Nora, no longer as a companion, no longer as nobody, as Miss Ashbourne, which was who she had always been. They walked the north pasture together on a morning in November, and he told her about the repairs he'd had done to the west wing roof, and she told him that her grandfather had had the same roof repaired in 1841, and that it would probably need doing again in 20 years. He listened with the attentive, serious expression she had come to know, and she thought, not for the first time, that she had misjudged him early on in the way that people misjudge each other when they are only seeing one side of a situation. "I'm sorry about the boots," he said without preamble. She looked at him. "It was my second day." "I know. You didn't know who I was." "I know that too. I'm still sorry. It wasn't." He paused. "It wasn't how I would have wished to be had I understood the situation." "Had you understood the situation," she said, "I would not have been there at all." He looked at the pasture for a moment. "No," he said. "I suppose not." And then quietly, "I'm glad you were." She did not answer right away. The wind off the hills was cold and clean, and the copper beech at the gate was bare now, its branches dark against the pale sky. She had spent 3 years being angry, and then careful, and then purposeful, and she had come back to this house with a plan and no room in it for anything else, and the plan had done what plans do. It had brought her to a room she had not planned to end up in, with a man she had not planned to encounter in this way, standing in a pasture that was, as far as the law was currently concerned, both of theirs. "So am I," she said. The solicitors finished their work in December. The determination held that the sale had been valid, but that Nora's claim under Clause 17 entitled her to first right of purchase at the original transfer price, a sum she could not have produced in any ordinary way, but which, as her solicitor pointed out, could be satisfied through other legal instruments if both parties were willing. Both parties were willing. The arrangement that was ultimately made was not one that the solicitors had proposed. It was one that Nora and the Duke had arrived at themselves, on a morning in late November, in the estate office, the same room where she had stood with the document in her hands and decided to stop being careful. It was the kind of arrangement that required, among other things, the reading of banns in the village church and the posting of a notice in the Halifax paper, and the writing of a long and somewhat complicated letter to the Countess's niece in London, who had been expecting a rather different outcome. Miss Croft, from what Nora heard later, took it with considerable composure. She was engaged to a baronet by spring. The Countess attended the wedding in the village church in March, and declared afterward that the breakfast was too small and the speeches too long, which Nora took as the highest possible form of approval. They were married on a Thursday, which was an ordinary day, which suited her. She had had enough of things that were supposed to be extraordinary, and turned out to be losses. Ordinary days at Ashbourne had always been the ones she loved best, the ones with mud on the drive and wood smoke from the library fire and the copper beech doing whatever the wind asked of it. She stood at the window that evening, the same window she had stood at as a child with her nose against the cold glass, watching the deer come out of the south wood at dusk. And she watched the deer come out of the south wood at dusk, and her husband came and stood beside her and did not say anything, which was one of the things she had learned to love about him. The house was hers. It had always been hers, in the way that mattered most. In memory, in bone, in the particular way the light moved through the east corridor in the morning, and the particular silence of the library in the late afternoon, and the particular sound of the wind off the northern hills that she had known since before she could name what knowing was. Now it was hers in every other way as well.